Juliana Morgan pressed her back against the boarding house wall and counted her breath in threes, a trick that usually kept the panic at bay, but was doing nothing now that Aunt Cordelia's carriage had rattled up Main Street with all the subtlety of a cavalry charge. She had exactly 12 minutes before her aunt descended upon the Whitman boarding house with her list of marriageable prospects, at the top of which sat Leonard Grisham, a man whose breath smelled of spoiled onions and whose conversation centered exclusively on the 17 ways to prepare organ meat. Juliana had endured one supper with Leonard 3 months prior in Bismarck, and the experience had left her with nightmares about kidney pies and a firm resolution never to repeat it. The problem was Aunt Cordelia, her late mother's elder sister, who controlled the small trust fund that kept Juliana fed and housed while she worked as a seamstress in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Her aunt had traveled all the way from Bismarck with Leonard in tow, determined to see Juliana properly settled before her 23rd birthday next month. The letters had been arriving for weeks, each one more insistent than the last, until finally Cordelia had simply announced she was coming and would hear no arguments. Juliana had tried arguments anyway by post. They had been ignored. Now she stood in the narrow hallway of the boarding house, watching through the lace curtains as her aunt's considerable form emerged from the coach, followed by Leonard Grisham himself, pale and blinking in the New Mexico sun like something that lived under rocks. Juliana felt her stomach turn over. "You look like you are fixing to bolt." The voice came from behind her, low and unhurried. She spun around and found herself looking up at Xavier Pike, who had taken the room next to hers 2 weeks ago and had so far distinguished himself by being the quietest person she had ever encountered. He was tall, with sun-darkened skin and gray eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing nothing. He worked as a ranch hand at the Double R spread outside town, and she had exchanged perhaps 30 words with him total, most of them her saying good morning and him tipping his hat in response. "I am fixing to bolt," she admitted, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. "But I have nowhere to bolt to." He waited, his stillness a contrast to her barely contained panic. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "My aunt is here to marry me off to that man." She gestured toward the window where Leonard was attempting to extract an enormous trunk from the coach. "And I need her to believe I am already engaged so she will leave me alone. I know this is insane. I know I have no right to ask. But would you pretend to be my fiancé for one dinner? Just one dinner, just tonight, and then you can go back to your life, and I will tell her you had to return to your ranch, and we can write letters or something, and she will go home and leave me in peace." Xavier looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked out the window at Aunt Cordelia and Leonard, then back at Juliana. "All right," he said. She blinked. "All right, one dinner." He said it the way another man might comment on the weather. "You will do it. Just said I would." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees went weak. Thank you so much. We just need to seem believable. Maybe hold my hand once or twice. Nothing elaborate." "We should probably work out some details," Xavier said, "so the story holds." She had not thought that far ahead. "Yes, good. We met when you came to the boarding house 2 weeks ago. No, that is too recent. We met 3 months ago when you came to town to deliver horses and I was walking back from the dress shop where I work. You courted me properly. We got engaged last week." "Why last week?" "Because I needed time to write to my aunt about it, but the letter must have crossed with hers saying she was coming." He nodded slowly. "What kind of ring would I have given you?" She looked down at her bare left hand and felt her heart sink. "I do not have a ring. My mother's ring is in my room," Xavier said. "Silver band, small turquoise stone. I can get it." "Your mother's ring?" Juliana stared at him. I cannot borrow your mother's ring. She is not using it anymore, died 4 years back. He said it plainly, without asking for sympathy. Ring should serve a purpose. Give me a minute. He disappeared into his room and returned before she could fully process what was happening. The ring sat in his calloused palm, simple and pretty, the turquoise the color of a summer sky. He took her left hand without ceremony and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. How did you know my size? She asked. Guess. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he had been paying more attention than she realized. Footsteps thundered on the porch. Aunt Cordelia's voice rang through the front door, demanding to know which room belonged to Miss Juliana Morgan. Here we go, Juliana whispered. Xavier slid his arm around her waist, the gesture so natural and easy that she almost forgot it was pretend. Let me do the talking at first, he said quietly. You are too nervous. You will give us away. Then Aunt Cordelia was upon them, a formidable woman in purple silk with a hat that featured at least 3 dead birds, her eyes sharp and assessing. Leonard trailed behind her like a ship being pulled by a particularly determined tugboat. Juliana. Aunt Cordelia's gaze swept over her, then landed on Xavier with the force of a physical blow. Who is this man and why is he touching you? Aunt Cordelia. Juliana's voice came out smaller than she intended. This is Xavier Pike, my fiancé. The silence that followed could have smothered a brush fire. You're what? Aunt Cordelia's face had gone an alarming shade of red. Xavier extended his free hand to her aunt, his expression polite and untroubled. Madam, pleasure to meet you. Juliana has told me a great deal about you. Cordelia ignored his hand. Juliana, this is absurd. You made no mention of any engagement in your letters. I tried, Juliana said, finding her footing now that Xavier's steady presence anchored her. I sent a letter 2 weeks ago. It must not have arrived before you left Bismarck. 2 weeks. Leonard spoke for the first time, his voice a nasal whine. But Mrs. Whitmore assured me that Miss Morgan was unattached and eager for a suitable match. Mrs. Whitmore does not know everything about my niece's private affairs, Cordelia snapped, though her expression suggested she was equally in the dark. She turned back to Xavier, her eyes narrowing. What are your prospects, Mr. Pike? What is your family? What do you own? I work cattle at the Double R Ranch, Xavier said, his tone even. My father owned a small spread up in Dakota Territory before he died, left it to my brother who runs it still. I have my wages, my horse, and my name. That is about it. That is nothing, Cordelia said flatly. Juliana, you cannot possibly be serious about this man. I am completely serious. Juliana surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. She looked up at Xavier and found him already looking down at her, something warm in those gray eyes that made her breath catch. I love him. The words hung in the air. Xavier's arm tightened slightly around her waist. You love him, Cordelia repeated, her skepticism sharp enough to cut glass. You love a cowboy you have known for all of 3 months. Yes, Juliana said, and meant it in that moment with an intensity that startled her. I love her too, Xavier added, his voice quiet but certain. Plan to spend my life proving it. Leonard made a strangled sound. Cordelia's jaw worked as though she were chewing something unpleasant. This is highly irregular, Cordelia finally said. I do not approve of hasty engagements to unsuitable men. However, I did not travel all this way to be turned around at the door. Leonard and I will be staying at the hotel, and you will join us for dinner tonight so I can properly assess this situation. If I find this engagement lacking in any way, Juliana, I will expect you to reconsider Mr. Grisham's very generous offer. What offer? Juliana asked. He never made me an offer. He is making it now, Cordelia said. Or he would be if you had not apparently attached yourself to this cowboy. Leonard looked as though he might be sick. Xavier looked unmoved. Dinner at 6 o'clock at the Palace Hotel dining room, Cordelia announced. Do not be late, and dress properly, both of you. She swept out with Leonard stumbling after her, leaving Juliana and Xavier standing in the hallway. Juliana waited until the front door closed before she let out the breath she had been holding. I am so sorry. I thought it would just be one dinner, but now she wants to assess you and probably interrogate us both, and I have dragged you into something much more complicated than I intended. It is all right, Xavier said. He had not moved his arm from around her waist. It is not all right. She's going to ask us 100 questions and try to catch us in lies, and Leonard is going to sit there smelling like onions and making sad eyes at me, and this is going to be a disaster. Then we had better get our story straight. Xavier steered her gently toward the small parlor at the back of the boarding house where they could talk without being overheard. Sit down before you fall down. She sat. He took the chair across from her, his long legs stretched out, his hands relaxed on the armrests. He looked like he had all the time in the world. Tell me about yourself, he said. The real things, so I can make it sound true tonight. Why do you need to know real things? Best lies are mostly truth, he said simply. Tell me about your family, so she did. She told him about her mother dying when she was 15, her father following 2 years later, both lost to influenza. About Aunt Cordelia taking control of her small inheritance and parceling it out in monthly allowances that kept Juliana dependent and grateful. About learning to sew because she needed some way to support herself that Cordelia could not object to. About loving New Mexico for its wide sky and dry heat, so different from the damp cold of Bismarck. Xavier listened without interrupting, his gray eyes steady on her face. When she finished, he nodded. My turn, he said. I am 30 years old, grew up in Dakota Territory on my father's ranch, learned cattle and horses before I could properly read. My mother taught me reading later from her Bible and whatever books came through. Father drank, but he was not mean about it, just sad. Lost the ranch bit by bit to bad luck and worse decisions. When he died, what was left went to my older brother Samuel. I did not mind. I like working for wages, simpler. I came south 2 years ago looking for steadier work. Found it at the Double R. Do you like it here? Juliana asked. I do now. He said it while looking directly at her, and her cheeks went warm. We should talk about how you proposed, she said quickly. Aunt Cordelia will definitely ask, how do you want it to have happened? She thought about it. Somewhere quiet. You are not a man for grand gestures. Maybe we were walking back from town one evening and you just asked. That would be true to form, Xavier agreed. But women usually want something to remember. I would remember a quiet proposal, Juliana said. I would remember it better than something elaborate. Something shifted in his expression, a softness that made her pulse quicken. All right then. I asked you during an evening walk, just past the old mission ruins on the edge of town. The sun was setting. I told you I knew I had no business asking, but I could not picture my future without you in it. You said yes. The way he told it, steady and plain, made it sound real, made it sound like something she wished had actually happened. That is perfect, she said quietly. What else will she ask? They spent the next hour constructing their fiction, building it out of small truths and careful details. They talked about how they spent their courting time, about what they knew of each other's habits, about the future they were supposedly planning. Xavier absorbed it all with the same calm attention he seemed to give everything, occasionally asking a question that made her realize how thorough he was being. By the time Mrs. Whitmore rang the bell for the afternoon meal, Juliana felt almost confident. Almost. One more thing, Xavier said as they stood to go. When we are around your aunt, I am going to act like a man in love, so do not startle when I do." "What does that mean?" "Means I will touch you more, hold your hand, look at you the way a man looks at his intended. If you jump every time, she will know something is wrong." He was right. She nodded. "I will try not to jump." "Good." He offered his arm and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the worn cotton of his shirt. They walked to the dining room together, and Juliana tried not to think about how easy it felt, how right. She had 6 hours to prepare for dinner. 6 hours to turn a desperate lie into a convincing truth. 6 hours to teach herself how to act like a woman in love with Xavier Pike. The truly frightening part was how little acting it might require. The Palace Hotel dining room glittered with crystal chandeliers and starched white tablecloths, a monument to elegance that seemed determined to remind Juliana of everything she was not. She had put on her best dress, a green cotton with lace at the collar that she had sewn herself, but next to Aunt Cordelia's imported silk and the other fine ladies dining around them, she felt like a sparrow among peacocks. Xavier had put on a clean shirt and vest, his dark hair combed back and still slightly damp. He looked uncomfortable in the formal setting, but he held himself with a quiet dignity that made Cordelia's obvious disdain feel small and petty. They found her aunt and Leonard already seated at a corner table, positioned so that Cordelia could observe the entire room. Leonard stood when they approached, his expression hovering somewhere between hopeful and miserable. Xavier pulled out Juliana's chair before Leonard could make the attempt, his hand brushing her shoulder as she sat. "You are late," Cordelia announced, though they were exactly on time. "My apologies, madam," Xavier said smoothly. "I wanted to pick some flowers for Juliana, and it took longer than expected." Juliana looked down and saw, tucked into her lap, 3 wildflowers she had not noticed him carrying. They were simple things, yellow and white, probably picked from the field behind the boarding house. They were perfect. "How thoughtful," she murmured, looking up at him with genuine gratitude. He met her eyes and smiled, a small private thing that made her forget for a moment that they were pretending. Cordelia cleared her throat. "Well, shall we order?" The meal began with a tense examination of the menu and evolved into an interrogation disguised as polite conversation. Cordelia asked Xavier about his prospects, his family, his intentions. She asked how often he attended church, whether he drank, what books he read. She asked about his politics and his plans and his past, each question delivered with the precision of a prosecuting attorney. Xavier answered everything with the same unflappable calm, never defensive, never evasive. Yes, he attended church when work allowed. No, he did not drink to excess, having seen what it did to his father. He read when he could, mostly newspapers and the occasional novel borrowed from the ranch owner's wife. He had voted for Grover Cleveland in the last election because he trusted a man who spoke plainly. He planned to keep working cattle until he had saved enough to buy a small piece of land, maybe up north where the grass grew thick and the winters were honest. "And where exactly does my niece fit into these plans?" Cordelia demanded. "Everywhere," Xavier said simply. He reached across the table and took Juliana's hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "She is the reason I am saving. The land is for both of us, for the life we are going to build." Juliana felt her throat tighten. He made it sound so real, so inevitable. "Building a life requires more than romantic notions," Cordelia snapped. "It requires financial stability. Mr. Grisham owns a very successful butcher shop in Bismarck. He has a house. He has savings. What do you have, Mr. Pike?" "He has me," Juliana said before Xavier could respond. She turned to her aunt, feeling the anger that had been building all evening finally find its voice. And that is all that matters. I do not want Leonard's butcher shop or his house. I want Xavier. I want the life we are going to build together, even if it is small and difficult. I want to marry a man I respect and care for, not a man who was chosen for me. Leonard flinched. Cordelia's eyes narrowed. You are being a foolish child, Cordelia said coldly. Romance fades, Juliana. Security does not. In 5 years, you will be tired and poor and full of regret, and I will not be there to rescue you from your own bad judgment. Then I will live with my choices, Juliana said. Like an adult. The silence that fell was glacial. A waiter appeared with their food, and they all pretended to eat while the tension built like a summer storm. Finally, Leonard spoke up, his voice thin and ready. Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps we should respect Miss Morgan's wishes. If she has found happiness with Mr. Pike, we should not stand in the way. Cordelia turned on him with a look that could have curdled milk. Mr. Grisham, do not mistake my intentions. I am not standing in the way of anything. I am attempting to save my niece from a disastrous mistake. If you are too weak to fight for your own interests, that is your failing, not mine. With respect, madam, Xavier said, his voice still quiet but now edged with something harder. Juliana is not a prize to be fought over. She has made her choice. The gentleman thing to do is honor it. Do not presume to lecture me on what is gentlemanly, Cordelia hissed. You are a ranch hand with nothing to offer but empty promises. I offer her freedom, Xavier said, to choose her own life. Seems that is more than you are offering. Cordelia's face went purple. For a moment, Juliana thought her aunt might actually leave the table in outrage, which would solve several problems at once. But Cordelia was made of sterner stuff. She drew herself up, her hands flat on the table, and fixed Xavier with a look that had probably made grown men weep. I am staying in Albuquerque for 1 week, she announced. During that time, I will be observing this engagement very closely. If I find any evidence that it is not genuine, if I suspect for even a moment that you are deceiving me, I will cut off Juliana's allowance entirely, and she will have no choice but to return to Bismarck with me. Do I make myself clear? Juliana's stomach dropped. A week. Her aunt was staying for a week. Perfectly clear, madam, Xavier said, his expression giving nothing away. Cordelia stood, forcing the rest of them to rise as well. Mr. Grisham and I will be at the hotel. Juliana, I expect to see you tomorrow at 10 o'clock. We will take breakfast together. You may bring Mr. Pike if you wish. I want to see how you behave together in the light of day when you have had time to reconsider this foolishness. She swept out, Leonard trailing apologetically behind her. As soon as they were gone, Juliana sank back into her chair, her hands shaking. I am so sorry, she whispered. A whole week. I never imagined she would stay a whole week. You cannot possibly keep this up for a week. Xavier sat down across from her again, his expression thoughtful. Why not? Because it is insane. Because you have a job and a life, and you should not have to spend every spare moment pretending to be my fiancé just because I panicked. Maybe I do not mind, he said. She looked up at him, searching his face for signs of resentment or frustration. She found neither. Why are you being so kind about this? You needed help, he said, as though it were that simple. I could help, so I did. But a whole week of lying and play-acting and dealing with my aunt's suspicion and hostility. I have dealt with worse. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on hers. Besides, it is not all play-acting, her heart stuttered. What do you mean? Mean some of it is real, he said quietly. You must know that. She did not know what to say to that. The dining room suddenly felt too warm, too bright, too full of other people who might overhear. Xavier stood and offered his hand. Come on. Let us walk back. You look like you could use some air. She took his hand and let him guide her out into the evening. The sun had set while they were inside, and the sky was the deep purple of approaching night. The air was cool and dry, scented with sage and dust. They walked in silence for a while, her hand still in his, both of them lost in their own thoughts. "What are we going to do?" Juliana asked finally. "She is going to be watching us constantly, looking for any crack in the story." "Then we do not give her one," Xavier said. "We act like what we are supposed to be, a couple in love who is planning a future together." "For a week." "For a week," he agreed, "unless you want to tell her the truth." Juliana shuddered at the thought. "If I tell her the truth, she will drag me back to Bismarck and marry me off to Leonard or someone equally terrible. I will lose what little independence I have. I cannot let that happen." "Then we keep going," Xavier said, "one day at a time." They had reached the old mission ruins he had mentioned earlier, crumbling adobe walls standing stark against the darkening sky. Without discussing it, they both stopped, looking out at the view of the town below, lights beginning to glow in windows like earthbound stars. "This is where you said you proposed," Juliana said softly, "in our story." "Yes," Xavier said. "It is a good spot for it." She could picture it too clearly, Xavier standing beside her in the fading light, his voice low and earnest, asking her to build a life with him. The image made her ache with a longing for something that had never happened. "Juliana." He turned to face her, his hand still holding hers. "I need to tell you something," her breath caught. "What?" "This started as me helping you out of a difficult situation," he said. "I do not regret that. But if we are going to keep this up for a week, you should know that I am not going to be pretending. Not entirely. I meant what I said in there. Some of this is real for me, Xavier." His name came out as barely more than a whisper. "I am not asking you to feel the same way," he continued. "I know this is not what you signed up for, but I am not going to lie about it either. So if that makes you uncomfortable, tell me now, and we will figure out something else." She looked up at him, at his honest gray eyes and the serious set of his mouth, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "What if I said I do not want to figure out something else?" His expression shifted, hope and caution warring in his face. "What are you saying?" "I am saying maybe I am not entirely pretending either," she admitted. "I did not expect this. I did not plan on it. But somewhere between you agreeing to help me and you giving me your mother's ring, and you standing up to my aunt like I was worth defending, something changed. And now I do not know what is real and what is the performance, but I know I do not want it to stop." Xavier reached up and cupped her face with his free hand, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," she breathed. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but she did not want to change her mind. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to know what it felt like to be kissed by a man who looked at her like she was something precious. When his lips met hers, gentle and certain, she felt the world narrow down to just the two of them, standing in the ruins of something old while building something new. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "So," he said, his voice rough. "1 week of pretending to be engaged, except we are not actually pretending." "That sounds about right," Juliana said, and felt laughter bubble up in her chest, giddy and bright. "This is the strangest courtship in the history of courtships." "Probably," he agreed, "but I will take it." They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, and when they reached the hallway where their rooms sat side by side, Xavier kissed her again, slower this time, like they had all the time in the world. "Get some rest," he murmured against her hair. "Tomorrow we face your aunt again." "Tomorrow," she agreed, though the idea of facing Aunt Cordelia seemed less daunting now that she knew Xavier would be beside her. Not pretending. Really beside her. She went to sleep that night with the taste of him still on her lips and the weight of his mother's ring on her finger, and dreamed of a future that might actually come true. Morning came too soon and too bright, sunlight streaming through Juliana's window like it had a personal grudge against restful sleep. She dressed carefully in a blue cotton day dress, fixing her hair with hands that still trembled slightly when she thought about what she and Xavier had admitted to each other the night before. He was waiting for her in the hallway, freshly shaved and serious in a clean shirt. When he saw her, his expression softened into something that made her heart skip. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." She felt suddenly shy, which was absurd given that she had kissed him thoroughly just hours ago. "Ready to face the dragon, ready as I will ever be." He offered his arm and she took it, and they walked together to the hotel where Aunt Cordelia had commanded their presence. Breakfast was an exercise in endurance. Cordelia had apparently spent the evening compiling a new list of invasive questions, which she deployed with ruthless efficiency. How did Xavier and Juliana spend their courtship? Where exactly did they go? Who had they told about their engagement? Had they discussed children? What about religion? Would Juliana be expected to work after marriage, or would Xavier's wages suffice? Xavier answered everything with the same steady patience, but now Juliana could see the care he was taking, the way he was building a picture of a life that might actually be possible. He talked about wanting 3 or 4 children eventually, about raising them to know hard work and kindness. He talked about Juliana continuing her sewing if she wanted to, because he believed a woman should have her own interests and income. He talked about building a small house with a porch that faced east, so they could watch the sunrise together over morning coffee. Cordelia's expression grew more and more pinched with each answer, because what he described was reasonable and thoughtful, and made it clear he had actually considered what a marriage to Juliana would look like. Leonard had not joined them for breakfast, apparently claiming a headache. Juliana suspected he was simply tired of watching Cordelia's campaign fail. "I would like to see where you live, Mr. Pike," Cordelia announced suddenly. "If you are to marry my niece, I should know what conditions she will be living in." Xavier did not even blink. "The boarding house is not much to see, madam, but you are welcome to visit." "Not the boarding house," Cordelia said impatiently. "The ranch where you work. I want to see your employment situation with my own eyes." Juliana felt her stomach clench. The Double R Ranch was a working cattle operation, not a show place. If Cordelia was expecting something grand, she was going to be deeply disappointed. "I can take you out there this afternoon if you like," Xavier said, "though it is just a bunkhouse and a lot of cattle, nothing fancy." "Nevertheless," Cordelia said, "I insist." So that afternoon found them all loaded into a hired wagon, bouncing along the rough road toward the Double R Ranch. Xavier drove while Juliana sat beside him, and Cordelia sat in the back, her face set in lines of grim determination. She had left Leonard at the hotel, probably because she wanted to focus her full attention on finding fault with Xavier's circumstances. The ranch, when they reached it, was exactly what Xavier had promised. A sprawling operation of corrals and outbuildings, cattle spread across the brown grassland, a big main house for the owner and a long bunkhouse for the hands. It was dusty and utilitarian and honest, a place where real work happened. Xavier helped Juliana down from the wagon, his hand steady on her waist, and then did the same for Cordelia, who accepted his assistance with visible reluctance. A tall man with graying hair emerged from the main house, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw Xavier. "Pike. Thought you had the day off." "I do, sir," Xavier said, "but Mrs. Whitmore wanted to see the ranch. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Thomas Reeves, owner of the Double R. Mr. Reeves, this is Juliana's aunt visiting from Dakota Territory. Thomas Reeves tipped his hat to Cordelia. Pleasure, madam. You here to inspect Xavier's prospects? Someone must, Cordelia said tartly. Thomas laughed, not offended in the slightest. Well, I can tell you Xavier is one of the best men I have got. Reliable, good with the animals, does not start fights or drink his wages. He has been here 2 years and I have not had a single complaint. If he is courting your niece, she could do a lot worse. That remains to be seen, Cordelia said. Thomas raised his eyebrows but remained diplomatic. Would you like a tour of the place? I can show you the operation, such as it is. They spent the next hour walking the grounds, Thomas explaining the cattle business with the ease of a man who loved his work. Cordelia asked pointed questions about wages and working conditions and prospects for advancement. Thomas answered honestly, making it clear that ranch work was hard and the pay was modest but steady, and a good hand could eventually earn a foreman position if he proved himself. Xavier has the makings of a foreman, Thomas said. Another few years and I would consider promoting him. He has the respect of the other men and the sense to make good decisions under pressure, Cordelia sniffed. How generous! Juliana felt her temper flare. Aunt Cordelia, he is giving Xavier high praise. You might try being gracious about it. I might try being gracious when I see something worth being gracious about, Cordelia retorted. This is a dusty cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere. Xavier is a hired hand with no property and no family wealth. These are facts, Juliana, not insults. They are also not the measure of a man's worth, Juliana said. You taught me that people should be judged by their character, not their bank accounts. Or was that only when it suited your lectures? Cordelia's face flushed. Before she could respond, Xavier stepped between them, his expression calm. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand your concerns, he said quietly. You want what is best for Juliana. That is natural, but what is best for her is not a rich man she does not love. It is a good man who will respect her and work hard to give her a decent life. I am that man. I know I do not have much now, but I am building towards something better, and I want to build it with her. If you cannot see that, then I am sorry, but it will not change my mind or hers. The silence that followed was heavy. Even Thomas Reeves looked impressed. Finally, Cordelia drew herself up. I will reserve my judgment, she said coldly, but I am not convinced, not yet. That is your right, madam, Xavier said. They rode back to town in tense silence. When they reached the hotel, Cordelia climbed down from the wagon without assistance and disappeared inside without a word of goodbye. Juliana waited until they were alone before she turned to Xavier. I am sorry. She is being impossible. She is being protective, Xavier said. In her own terrible way, cannot fault her for that. I can absolutely fault her for that, Juliana said. She is treating you like you are not good enough when you are more than good enough. You are kind and patient and honest, and you are putting up with all of this insanity because I asked you to, and she cannot even manage basic courtesy. Xavier climbed down from the wagon and came around to her side, looking up at her with those steady gray eyes. Juliana, breathe. She took a breath, then another. I just hate that she is making you prove yourself when you have already proven everything that matters. Maybe I need to prove it, he said, for your sake, so when we tell people we are getting married for real, there is no question about it. She stared at him. When we tell people we are getting married for real, did you think I was still pretending? He reached up and lifted her down from the wagon, his hands strong around her waist, and did not let go even after her feet touched the ground. I meant what I said last night. This is real for me. All of it. But we have only known each other 2 weeks, Juliana said weakly. People do not decide to get married after 2 weeks. People decide all sorts of things in all sorts of time frames, Xavier said. I know what I want. Question is, do you? She looked at him, at the quiet certainty in his face, and felt her heart make up its mind. Yes, she said. Yes, I want this. I want you. I want all of it, the small house with the porch facing east and the morning coffee and the life we are going to build together. I want it to be real. He kissed her right there in the street, in full view of anyone who cared to look, and Juliana kissed him back with her whole heart, relief and joy flooding through her in equal measure. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling like fools. So we are really doing this, Juliana said. We are actually getting engaged. We are already engaged, Xavier pointed out. Have been for 2 days now, according to everyone we have told. You know what I mean? I do. He took her hand, his thumb running over the turquoise ring that had become so familiar in such a short time. And yes, we are really doing this. They walked back to the boarding house in a daze of happiness, making quiet plans for a future that no longer felt like fiction. They would need to save money for a small wedding, something simple but proper. They would need to find a place to live, maybe rent a little house in town until they could afford land of their own. They would need to tell the people who mattered, the few friends Juliana had made in Albuquerque and Xavier's boss at the Double R. And they would need to continue convincing Aunt Cordelia that the engagement was legitimate, except now it actually was, which made the task both easier and more complicated. The next several days fell into a pattern. Each morning, Juliana and Xavier would meet Cordelia for breakfast or lunch, and each time Cordelia would deploy new tactics to test the strength of their supposed relationship. She asked them to recount how they met, listening for inconsistencies. She asked them personal questions designed to reveal how little they knew about each other. She observed how they interacted, watching for signs of awkwardness or pretense. What she found instead was two people genuinely falling deeper in love with each passing day. Xavier continued to be unfailingly patient with Cordelia's suspicions and hostility, never losing his temper, never being anything less than respectful. Juliana watched him handle her aunt's worst behavior with grace and felt herself falling harder for him with each interaction. He was steady in a way she had never experienced before, solid and real and completely trustworthy. In the evenings, after they had satisfied Cordelia's daily requirement for surveillance, Xavier and Juliana would walk together through town or sit on the boarding house porch, talking about everything and nothing. He told her stories about growing up on his father's failing ranch, about learning to read from his mother's patient teaching, about the day he decided to head south and make his own way. She told him about her parents, about the loneliness of losing them both so young, about her dreams of having her own dress shop someday where she could design beautiful things for women who deserve to feel beautiful. They talked about practical matters too. Xavier had been saving his wages carefully, and he showed her the small account book where he tracked every dollar. Between his savings and her allowance from Aunt Cordelia, assuming Cordelia did not cut her off, they could afford to rent a modest house. If they both kept working, they might be able to save enough for a down payment on a piece of land within a few years. What if Cordelia does cut off my allowance? Juliana asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. Then we make do with less, Xavier said simply. Might take us longer to get the land, but we will manage. I am not going to let her threats dictate our lives. You say that like it is easy. It is easy, he said. I want to be with you. Everything else is just details. She leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, leather and soap and something that was just Xavier. How did I get this lucky? I have been asking myself the same question, he said, and kissed the top of her head. On the 5th day of Cordelia's visit, disaster struck in the form of Mrs. Whitmore, the boarding house proprietor. Juliana and Xavier were having breakfast in the boarding house dining room when Mrs. Whitmore bustled over, her round face alight with curiosity. "Mr. Pike, Miss Morgan, I just heard the most extraordinary news," she said. "Is it true you are engaged? How marvelous! And here I thought you barely knew each other, what with Mr. Pike only moving in 2 weeks ago. But I suppose these things happen quickly sometimes." "Still, 2 weeks is quite fast for an engagement, is it not?" Juliana felt the blood drain from her face. Xavier's expression did not change, but his hand found hers under the table and squeezed. "We met before Mr. Pike moved into the boarding house," Juliana said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He has been in town for several months." "Oh," Mrs. Whitmore's eyebrows climbed. "How strange. I could have sworn he mentioned being new to Albuquerque when he took the room." "Perhaps I misremembered." "Perhaps," Xavier said neutrally. Mrs. Whitmore looked between them, her curiosity clearly unsatisfied but too polite to push further. "Well, congratulations in any case. Have you set a date?" "Not yet," Juliana managed. "We are still working out the details." Of course. Mrs. Whitmore patted Juliana's shoulder and bustled away, but the damage was done. "She is going to mention that to Aunt Cordelia," Juliana whispered. "I know she is. They were talking at church on Sunday. If Cordelia finds out the timeline does not match what we told her, she will know we are lying." "Then we need to talk to Mrs. Whitmore first," Xavier said. "Explain the situation. Ask her to keep the details vague if your aunt asks." "Will she do that?" "Only one way to find out." They found Mrs. Whitmore in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with the vigor of a woman half her age. When Xavier explained the situation, carefully framing it as a matter of romantic timing rather than outright deception, Mrs. Whitmore listened with her head tilted like a curious bird. "So you are saying you truly are engaged," she said slowly. "But you told Mrs. Whitmore a different story about when you met." "We wanted it to seem more respectable," Juliana said, bending the truth only slightly. "Aunt Cordelia is very traditional. If she knew Xavier and I had only known each other a short time, she would not approve. But the engagement is real, Mrs. Whitmore. I promise you that." Mrs. Whitmore studied them both, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Finally, she nodded. "I will keep your secret, such as it is. But only because I can see you care for each other genuinely. If I thought you were playing games, I would not help you lie to anyone, family or not." "Thank you," Juliana said, relief washing through her. "Truly, thank you." "Just make sure you actually get married," Mrs. Whitmore said tartly. "I do not approve of long engagements. They lead to trouble." "Yes, madam," Xavier said, and Juliana saw the corner of his mouth twitch with suppressed amusement, but the close call rattled them both. That afternoon, when they met Cordelia for lunch at the hotel restaurant, Juliana felt jumpy and nervous, sure her aunt could read the guilt on her face. Cordelia, as though sensing weakness, went for the throat. "I spoke with Mrs. Whitmore this morning," she announced halfway through the meal. "She had some interesting observations about your engagement." Juliana's heart stopped. "Oh." "She mentioned that it seemed quite sudden," Cordelia continued, her eyes fixed on Juliana like a hawk watching a mouse. "Given that Mr. Pike has only been living at the boarding house for 2 weeks. We met before he moved in," Xavier said, his voice calm. "As we have explained." "So you have," Cordelia said. "And yet when I asked Mrs. Whitmore if she had seen you courting during those months you claimed to have been together, she said she could not recall ever seeing you arrive together or leave together." "Strange, is it not?" "Not strange at all," Xavier said. "I was living in the bunkhouse at the Double R for most of that time. I only moved to the boarding house recently because I wanted to be closer to Juliana. We did our courting away from the boarding house because we wanted privacy. How convenient, Cordelia said. Privacy that conveniently means no one can verify your story. Our story does not need verification, Juliana said, finding her spine. We are two adults who are choosing to marry each other. That should be enough. It is not enough, Cordelia snapped. Not when I suspect you are lying to me. Not when I think you invented this engagement specifically to avoid marrying Mr. Grisham. The accusation hung in the air. Juliana felt panic rise in her throat. They had been so careful, so consistent, but Cordelia's instincts were sharp, and she was not going to be fooled easily. We are not lying, Xavier said, and the conviction in his voice was so absolute that even Juliana almost believed they had been engaged for months instead of days. I love Juliana. I want to marry her. I understand you do not think I am good enough for her, but that does not make our engagement false. It just means we disagree about what she deserves. What she deserves is security, Cordelia hissed. What she deserves is a husband who can provide for her properly. What she deserves is not to throw her life away on a cowboy with nothing but empty promises. Aunt Cordelia, that is enough. Juliana stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. I am grateful for everything you have done for me since my parents died. I am grateful for the allowance and the help, but I am not grateful for this. Xavier is a good man who treats me with respect and kindness. He listens to me. He values my opinions. He makes me happy. That is worth more than all of Leonard Grisham's savings accounts and butcher shops combined. If you cannot accept that, then I am sorry, but I am marrying Xavier with or without your blessing. She turned and walked out of the restaurant, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She made it to the street before the shaking started, leaning against the hotel wall and trying to remember how to breathe. Xavier was there moments later, his hands on her shoulders, his voice low and steady. You are all right. Just breathe. You are all right. I ruined it, she gasped. I lost my temper and now she's going to cut me off and we will have nothing. We will have each other, Xavier said firmly. That is not nothing. But the money, the allowance, I need it, Xavier. I do not make enough from sewing alone. If she cuts me off, I will not be able to afford my room. I will have nowhere to live. You will live with me, he said simply. We will get married sooner than we planned. We will figure it out, but I am not going to stand by and let her bully you into doubting yourself. You did the right thing in there. She looked up at him, at his steady gray eyes and the absolute certainty in his face, and felt the panic start to recede. You would really do that? Marry me early, take on my problems, risk everything? Already told you, he said. All the other stuff is just details. You are what matters. She kissed him right there on the street, not caring who saw, pouring all her fear and gratitude and love into it. When they broke apart, she felt steadier, ready to face whatever came next. What came next was Aunt Cordelia emerging from the hotel, her face set in grim lines. Juliana, we need to talk, she said, privately. Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of Xavier, Juliana replied. Cordelia's jaw tightened. Very well. I have made my decision. I do not believe this engagement is genuine. I think you concocted it to avoid Mr. Grisham. However, I also know that you are old enough to make your own choices, even foolish ones. So I am returning to Bismarck tomorrow, and I am leaving you to face the consequences of those choices. Does that mean you are cutting off my allowance? Juliana asked, her voice steadier than she felt. No, Cordelia said, and Juliana nearly sagged with relief. I will continue the allowance for now because I am not cruel enough to leave you destitute based on suspicions alone. But make no mistake, Juliana. If this engagement falls apart, if I discover you have been deceiving me, the allowance ends immediately and you will be on your own. Do you understand? I understand, Juliana said. And you, Mr. Pike. Cordelia turned her formidable gaze on Xavier. If you hurt my niece, if you prove yourself to be the unreliable fortune hunter I suspect you are, I will make certain everyone knows it. Your reputation will be ruined. Do you understand? Yes, madam, Xavier said, but you are wrong about me, and eventually you will see that. Cordelia sniffed. We shall see. Goodbye, Juliana. I expect you to write to me regularly with updates on your wedding plans. If I do not receive letters, I will assume the worst. She turned and went back into the hotel without waiting for a response. Juliana and Xavier stood in the street, watching her go. That was not the worst outcome, Xavier said finally. No, Juliana agreed, but it was not exactly a victory either. We are still together, he pointed out. You still have your allowance. She is leaving tomorrow. Seems like a victory to me. She laughed, feeling giddy and exhausted and relieved all at once. I suppose when you put it that way. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, and for the first time in days, Juliana felt like she could breathe properly. The week of pretending was over. Aunt Cordelia would be gone. And the engagement that had started as a desperate lie was now the truest thing in her life. That evening, after dinner at the boarding house, Xavier walked Juliana to her door and hesitated, his hand still holding hers. There is something I need to say, he told her. That sounds ominous. It is not ominous. He took a breath. When this started, you asked me to pretend for one dinner, then it became a week. Now your aunt is leaving and there is no reason to keep pretending. Except I do not want to stop. I want this to be real. I want to actually marry you, Juliana. Not because your aunt is watching or because we need to keep up appearances, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore. Her throat tightened with emotion. I want that too. I have wanted it since the night at the Mission ruins when we stopped pretending. Then let us do it properly, Xavier said. He let go of her hand and to her shock, dropped to one knee right there in the boarding house hallway. Juliana Morgan, will you marry me? For real this time. No pretending, no performance. Just you and me building a life together. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. Yes, yes, of course yes. He stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her with an intensity that made her forget they were standing in a semi-public hallway where anyone could see. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. We should probably set a date, he murmured. How about soon, she suggested, before anything else can go wrong. Soon works for me. He kissed her again, softer this time. How does 3 weeks sound? That should give us time to arrange things properly. 3 weeks sounds perfect. They stood in the hallway for a long time, just holding each other, both of them marveling at how something that had started as a desperate lie had turned into the most honest thing either of them had ever done. The next morning they saw Aunt Cordelia and Leonard off at the stagecoach station. Leonard looked relieved to be leaving. Cordelia looked skeptical but resigned. I meant what I said, Cordelia told Juliana as she prepared to board. If this engagement is false, there will be consequences. It is not false, Juliana said firmly, and you will see that when you receive our wedding invitation. Cordelia's eyebrows rose. You have set a date, 3 weeks from today, Xavier said. We would be honored if you would attend, though we understand if the journey is too much. 3 weeks, Cordelia repeated. That is very sudden. We have waited long enough, Juliana said and took Xavier's hand, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. There is no reason to delay. Cordelia studied them both for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, her expression softened just slightly. Write to me with the details, she said. I will try to come, though I make no promises. It was not quite approval, but it was closer than Juliana had hoped for. She watched the stage coach roll away, taking her aunt and Leonard and all the stress of the past week with it, and felt nothing but relief. "So," Xavier said, "we have 3 weeks to plan a wedding." "That should be interesting," Juliana said. "I have never planned a wedding before." "Neither have I." He grinned at her, and she was struck again by how much she loved his smile, the way it transformed his usually serious face. "Good thing we are in this together." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of happy chaos. They found a small house to rent on the edge of town. 2 rooms and a kitchen with that porch facing east that Xavier had promised. Juliana sewed her own wedding dress, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, working late into the evenings by lamplight. Xavier arranged for the ceremony to be held at the small church where they occasionally attended services, and invited his boss and the other ranch hands. Juliana invited the women she had become friendly with from the dress shop and a few neighbors from the boarding house. They wrote to Cordelia with the details and received a terse reply saying she would attend, which surprised them both. Apparently, she had decided that if the engagement was going to proceed regardless of her opinion, she might as well witness it firsthand. The day before the wedding, Xavier took Juliana out to see the little house one more time, to make sure everything was ready. It was modest but clean, with whitewashed walls and a floor that did not have too many gaps. He had borrowed a bed from Thomas Reeves and bought a small table and 2 chairs. Juliana had sewn curtains for the windows and brought a few of her belongings over. It was not much, but it felt like home. "What do you think?" Xavier asked, watching her face. "I think it is perfect," she said honestly. "I think we are going to be happy here." "I am already happy," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Anywhere with you would be perfect." She kissed him, long and thorough, trying to convey everything she felt but did not have words for. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Tomorrow we get married," Juliana said, still slightly awed by the reality of it. "Tomorrow you become Juliana Pike," Xavier said. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," she admitted. "Though it still feels surreal. A month ago I did not even know you, now I am marrying you." "Having second thoughts. Not even one," she assured him. "You, not a single one." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Juliana Morgan. I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret it," she said softly. "You saved me, Xavier, not just from Leonard and my aunt, but from a life where I did not get to choose. You gave me freedom and safety and love all at once. That is not something I will ever take for granted." They stood on the porch of their little house, watching the sun sink below the horizon, and Juliana thought about the strange chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A desperate request in a boarding house hallway. A cowboy who agreed to help without asking for anything in return. A week of pretending that had turned into something real and true and lasting. She had asked him to pretend they were engaged for one dinner. He had never broken character, had played the part of devoted fiancé so convincingly that even she had started to believe it. But somewhere in the middle of all that pretending, it had stopped being a performance and started being the truth. The wedding ceremony was small and simple, held in the late afternoon when the day's heat had started to ease. Juliana wore her white cotton dress and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Xavier had picked that morning. He wore his best shirt and vest, his dark hair neatly combed, his gray eyes serious and full of love. Aunt Cordelia sat in the front pew, her expression inscrutable. Leonard had not come, which was a relief to everyone. Thomas Reeves sat next to his wife, beaming like a proud father. The ranch hands filled the other pews, along with Juliana's friends from town and Mrs. Whitmore from the boarding house. The minister was an elderly man named Reverend Thompson, who had a kind face and a tendency to ramble. He kept the ceremony mercifully short, focusing on the importance of commitment and mutual respect in marriage. When he asked Xavier if he would take Juliana to be his lawful wedded wife, Xavier said, "I do," with such conviction that several people in the congregation smiled. When it was Juliana's turn, she looked up at Xavier and felt her heart swell. "I do," she said clearly, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They exchanged simple gold bands that Xavier had purchased with his carefully saved wages. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed her with a gentleness that made tears spring to her eyes. The small gathering erupted in applause. Juliana turned to face their friends and family as Mrs. Xavier Pike, and caught sight of Aunt Cordelia dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. It was the first crack in her aunt's armor, and Juliana felt a surge of hope that maybe, eventually, Cordelia would come to accept her choice. The reception was held in the church hall, a simple affair of cake and punch and sandwiches. People congratulated them, shook Xavier's hand, hugged Juliana. Thomas Reeves made a short speech about what a good man Xavier was, and how lucky he was to have found such a fine woman. Mrs. Whitmore cried openly, and told everyone who would listen that she had known from the start they were meant for each other. Aunt Cordelia approached them as the afternoon wore on, her expression still guarded but less hostile than before. "Juliana," she said formally, "Mr. Pike, I wish you both happiness." "Thank you, Aunt Cordelia," Juliana said, surprised by the words. Cordelia hesitated, then added, "I still think you could have done better in terms of financial security. But I will admit that Mr. Pike seems genuinely devoted to you. That counts for something." "It counts for everything," Juliana said softly. "Yes. Well." Cordelia smoothed her skirts, uncomfortable with sentiment. "I will be leaving tomorrow morning, but I expect regular letters updating me on your situation, and if you need help if circumstances become difficult, you are to write to me immediately. Do you understand?" "I understand," Juliana said, and impulsively hugged her aunt. Cordelia went stiff with surprise, then awkwardly patted Juliana's back. "Yes. Well, do not make me regret allowing this," Cordelia muttered, but there was less bite in her words than usual. As the sun began to set, Xavier and Juliana said goodbye to their guests and walked hand in hand to their little house on the edge of town. Someone, probably Mrs. Whitmore, had tied white ribbons to the porch railing and left a basket of food on the doorstep. Xavier unlocked the door and then, before Juliana could step inside, he swept her up in his arms. "What are you doing?" she laughed. "Carrying my bride across the threshold," he said, as though it were obvious. "It is tradition." He carried her inside and set her down gently in the middle of their small front room. The evening light streamed through the windows, painting everything gold. Juliana looked around at their modest home, at the furniture they had gathered and the curtains she had sewn and the life they were beginning together, and felt overwhelmingly grateful. "Happy?" Xavier asked, watching her face. "Happier than I have ever been," she said honestly. He pulled her close, his arms around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. "Good, that is all I want, to make you happy." "You do," she assured him. "Every single day." They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, both of them marveling at how their lives had changed. Then Xavier pulled back slightly and looked down at her with a small smile. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Anything. The first time I saw you, the day I moved into the boarding house, I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. But you looked sad, even when you smiled. I wanted to do something about that, but I did not know how. Then you asked me to pretend to be your fiancé, and I thought maybe this was my chance. A chance to get to know you, to make you smile for real. I never expected to fall in love with you. But I did, so fast and so hard that I could barely keep up with it. Juliana felt tears spill down her cheeks. I fell in love with you too. I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude, just relief at being rescued from Leonard. But it was never that simple. You were kind and steady and real, and I had never met anyone like you before. You made me feel safe and valued and seen. That is a powerful thing, Xavier. You are the powerful thing, he said, brushing away her tears with his thumbs. You stood up to your aunt. You chose your own path. You trusted me with your heart. That takes courage. I learned courage from you, she said. You never wavered, not once. Not when my aunt was terrible to you, not when the situation got complicated, not when you could have walked away. You stayed. That taught me what real strength looks like. He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Juliana felt the last of her worries melt away. They had gotten married under somewhat unusual circumstances, but the love between them was undeniable. This was real. This was forever. The months that followed were hard in the way that starting a new life together is always hard, but they were also filled with joy. Xavier continued working at the Double R, leaving early each morning and returning at dusk, tired but satisfied. Juliana built up her sewing business, taking on more clients from town and beginning to design her own patterns. The money was tight, but they made it work. They fell into comfortable rhythms. Xavier would make coffee in the mornings while Juliana cooked breakfast. They would sit on the porch facing east and watch the sunrise, just as he had promised, talking about their plans for the day. In the evenings, she would work on her sewing while he read or repaired tack, both of them content in the quiet companionship. They wrote to Aunt Cordelia regularly, as promised. The letters they received in return were stiff and formal at first, but gradually became warmer. Cordelia reported on happenings in Bismarck, sent recipes she thought Juliana might like, asked questions about their daily life. She never quite admitted she had been wrong about Xavier, but the subtext was clear. By the end of the first year, Xavier had been promoted to foreman at the Double R, which came with a substantial raise in pay. They celebrated by buying a few chickens and starting a small vegetable garden behind their house. It was not much, but it felt like progress, like they were building something solid and lasting. One evening in late summer, as they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge, Juliana told Xavier she was pregnant. He went very still, his hand tightening around hers. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," she said, unable to keep the smile off her face. "I saw the doctor this afternoon. He says the baby should come in early spring." Xavier stood up and pulled her to her feet, holding her close. She felt his heart pounding against her chest, fast and hard. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are going to have a baby," she confirmed. He kissed her, his hands gentle on her face, and when he pulled back his eyes were bright. "I am going to be a father." "You are going to be an excellent father," Juliana said firmly. "The best father. Our child is so lucky." They wrote to Aunt Cordelia with the news, and her response came back swiftly, full of advice and warnings and cautious congratulations. She said she would try to come when the baby was born if her health allowed. The pregnancy was relatively easy, though Juliana tired more quickly than usual and had to cut back on some of her sewing work. Xavier fussed over her constantly, making sure she ate enough and rested enough and did not lift anything heavy. She found it endearing rather than smothering, this evidence of how much he cared. In early March, 2 weeks before the baby was due, Aunt Cordelia arrived in Albuquerque, accompanied by an enormous amount of luggage and a determined expression. "I have come to help," she announced when Xavier met her at the stagecoach station. "Whether you want my help or not." "We want your help," Juliana assured her, hugging her aunt carefully around her swollen belly. "Thank you for coming." Cordelia's expression softened as she looked at Juliana. "You look well. Marriage and impending motherhood agree with you." "They do," Juliana agreed, smiling up at Xavier. Cordelia stayed with them in their small house, sleeping on a pallet in the front room and taking over the cooking and cleaning so Juliana could rest. It was strange having her there after all this time, but also comforting. For all her sharp edges, Cordelia genuinely cared about Juliana's welfare, and it showed in 100 small ways. The baby came on a warm March evening, after a labor that lasted most of the day. Xavier held Juliana's hand through all of it, pale but steady, murmuring encouragement and love. When the midwife finally placed a squalling, red-faced infant in Juliana's arms, Xavier sat down hard on the floor, overcome. "It is a boy," the midwife announced. "A healthy boy." Juliana looked down at her son, at his tiny fists and scrunched-up face, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. Xavier climbed back to his feet and came to sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the baby with wonder. "He is perfect." "What will you name him?" Cordelia asked from the doorway. Her usual sternness softened by tears. Juliana looked at Xavier. They had discussed names but had not quite decided. "What do you think?" "Everett, that was your father's name, was it not?" "Everett," Xavier repeated, testing the sound. "Everett Pike. Yes, I like that." So Everett Pike entered the world small and loud and utterly adored. Cordelia stayed for 2 weeks helping with the baby and the household, and gradually Juliana saw a different side of her aunt. Cordelia was gentle with little Everett, singing him old lullabies and rocking him when he fussed. She was patient with Juliana's exhaustion and anxiety. She even warmed toward Xavier, grudgingly admitting that he was a devoted husband and father. "I was wrong about you," Cordelia told Xavier one evening as they all sat together in the small front room, Everett asleep in Juliana's arms. "I thought you were after Juliana's allowance, or that you would prove unreliable, but you have done neither. You have made my niece happy, and that is worth more than financial security." Xavier inclined his head, accepting the apology with grace. "Thank you, madam. That means a great deal coming from you." "Yes, well," Cordelia cleared her throat. "I am still not convinced that this tiny house and your modest wages are ideal circumstances for raising a child. But you are managing, and Juliana is clearly content, so I will refrain from further criticism." "We appreciate that," Juliana said, trying not to smile at how hard it was for her aunt to fully let go of her disapproval. When Cordelia finally left to return to Bismarck, she hugged them both tightly and made them promise to write with updates on Everett's progress. "I will visit again when I can," she said. "A child should know his family." "He will know you," Juliana assured her, "and he will know you love him." After Cordelia left, life settled into a new normal. The days were exhausting, filled with feedings and diaper changes and the constant needs of an infant, but they were also full of small joys. Everett's first smile, his first laugh, the way he would calm immediately when Xavier sang to him in a low, rumbling voice. The way he would grip Juliana's finger with his tiny hand, holding on like she was his whole world. Xavier was a devoted father, getting up for night feedings without complaint, walking the floor with a fussy Everett so Juliana could sleep. He talked to their son constantly, telling him stories about the ranch and the cattle and the wide New Mexico sky. Juliana would watch them together, her heart overflowing with love for both of them. 2 years passed in a blur of sleepless nights and toddler chaos and deepening love. Xavier's wages continued to increase as he proved himself invaluable to the Double R, and they were finally able to start saving seriously for the piece of land they dreamed of. Juliana's sewing business flourished as her reputation grew, and she began selling her designs to women throughout the territory. When Everett was 2, Juliana became pregnant again. This time the news felt less overwhelming and more like a natural next step. They were ready for another child, eager to give Everett a sibling. "Another boy or a girl this time, do you think?" Xavier asked one evening, his hand resting on Juliana's still flat stomach. "A girl," Juliana said decisively. "I can feel it." She was right. Their daughter was born in late autumn, arriving quickly and efficiently as though she had places to be. She had Xavier's gray eyes and Juliana's dark hair, and she was beautiful. "Her name is Marielle," Juliana said, holding her daughter close. "Marielle Pike." "Marielle," Xavier repeated, smiling. "It is perfect. She is perfect." Everett, now a chattering 2-year-old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He wanted to hold her constantly, to help with her care, to tell her everything he knew about the world. Xavier and Juliana watched their children together and felt the deep satisfaction of a life well built. Cordelia visited again when Marielle was 3 months old, and this time she stayed for a month, clearly reluctant to leave her growing family. She had softened considerably over the years, her sharp edges worn down by love and time. She doted on Everett and Marielle, spoiling them with small gifts and endless patience. "You have done well for yourself, Juliana," Cordelia told her niece one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching Xavier play with the children in the yard. "I admit I did not think this marriage would work, but I was wrong. You chose wisely." "I chose with my heart," Juliana said. "And my heart knew what it was doing." "Apparently so." Cordelia watched Xavier lift Everett high in the air, making the boy shriek with laughter. "He is a good man, and you are happy. That is all I ever wanted for you, even if I had a strange way of showing it." "I know, Aunt Cordelia," Juliana said softly. "I have always known." When Cordelia left this time, she extracted a promise from Xavier and Juliana to visit her in Bismarck the following summer. "The children should see where their mother grew up," she said. "And I am too old to keep traveling this distance. You must come to me next time." They promised, and the following June they made the long journey north with 2 small children in tow. It was chaos and exhausting and wonderful, and Cordelia's joy at having them in her home was evident in every detail. She showed Everett and Marielle the house where Juliana had grown up, told them stories about their mother as a girl, baked cookies with them in the kitchen where she had once taught Juliana to cook. On their last evening in Bismarck, Cordelia hosted a small dinner party, inviting a few of her friends to meet Juliana's family. Leonard Grisham was among the guests, now married to a quiet woman who worked in his butcher shop. He was civil to Xavier and Juliana, though clearly still uncomfortable around them. Toward the end of the evening, Cordelia stood and raised her glass. "I would like to make a toast," she announced, "to my niece Juliana and her husband Xavier. When they first told me they were engaged, I did not believe it was real. I thought it was a scheme to avoid a more suitable match." She smiled slightly, acknowledging her own stubbornness. "But I was wrong. Their love was real from the start, even if I could not see it. And now they have built a beautiful life together, with 2 wonderful children and a partnership based on mutual respect and devotion. I am proud to call them family. To Juliana and Xavier." "To Juliana and Xavier," the other guests echoed, raising their glasses. Juliana felt tears prick her eyes. Xavier reached under the table and squeezed her hand, his thumb running over the turquoise ring she still wore on her right hand. the silver band from his mother that had been the beginning of everything. After the dinner party, when the guests had left and the children were asleep upstairs, Cordelia pulled Juliana aside. "I need to tell you something," Cordelia said. "Something I should have said years ago. I am sorry, Juliana. I am sorry for trying to control your life, for pushing Leonard on you, for doubting your judgment. You have always been wiser than I gave you credit for. Forgive me." Juliana hugged her aunt tightly. "There is nothing to forgive. You were trying to protect me in the only way you knew how. I understand that now." "You are generous," Cordelia said, her voice thick with emotion. "More generous than I deserve." "You are my family," Juliana said simply. "And family forgives." They returned to New Mexico at the end of the summer, brown and tired and happy. The children had loved meeting their great-aunt Cordelia properly, and Juliana felt a sense of completion, as though a circle had finally closed. Life continued its steady rhythm. Xavier was promoted again, this time to head foreman of the entire Double R operation, which came with a small house on the ranch property. They moved there when Marielle was 3, leaving behind their little house in town with some nostalgia, but also excitement for the future. The ranch house was bigger, with 3 bedrooms and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. There was space for the children to run and play, and the work was closer for Xavier. By the time Everett was 8 and Marielle was 6, Xavier and Juliana had saved enough to buy their own piece of land, a small spread north of Albuquerque with good grass and a creek running through it. It was not much, just 50 acres and a barn that needed repair, but it was theirs. They moved again, this time to the land they had dreamed about for so long. Xavier continued working at the Double R while slowly building up their own small herd of cattle. Juliana divided her time between motherhood, her sewing business, and helping Xavier with the ranch work. The children thrived in the open space, growing strong and confident and kind. Cordelia visited less frequently as she aged, but she wrote letters faithfully, keeping up with every detail of her grandnephew and grandniece's lives. When Everett was 10, she came for what would be her last visit, her health failing but her spirit still sharp. She spent a week with them, soaking in the sight of the life they had built. The small but growing ranch. The children, now older and full of personality. The easy partnership between Xavier and Juliana, still clearly devoted to each other after a decade of marriage. On her last evening, Cordelia asked to sit on the porch with Xavier and Juliana while the children played in the yard. "I need you both to know something," she said, her voice weaker than it once had been. "You have given me great joy. Watching your family grow, seeing the life you have built together, has been one of the great privileges of my later years. I was wrong about so many things when we first met, Xavier. But I am glad I was wrong. I am glad Juliana chose you. You have been everything she needed and more." "Thank you, madam," Xavier said quietly. "That means the world coming from you," Cordelia smiled. "I have one last confession to make. That dinner, the very first one where you pretended to be engaged, I suspected even then that something was not quite right. The story was too convenient, the timing too perfect. But I also saw the way you looked at her, Xavier, like she was the most important thing in the world. And I thought, if this is an act, it is a very good one. If this is real, she has chosen well. So I decided to watch and wait." Juliana stared at her aunt. "You knew the whole time," "I suspected," Cordelia corrected. "I was not certain until later, when it became clear that whatever had started as pretense had become genuine. That was when I decided to step back and let you make your own choices. Because even if the engagement began as a lie, the love was unmistakably true." Xavier and Juliana looked at each other, both of them stunned. "You never said anything," Juliana said. "What would have been the point?" Cordelia asked. You were already in love. You were already committed to each other. Exposing the initial deception would only have caused unnecessary pain. Better to let you build your life together and prove me wrong about everything else. You are a surprising woman, Aunt Cordelia, Xavier said, a smile tugging at his mouth. I am a stubborn old woman who took too long to admit when she was wrong, Cordelia replied. But I am admitting it now. You were right, both of you. Love matters more than security. Happiness matters more than status. And sometimes the best thing you can do for the people you love is trust them to know their own hearts. She died 6 months later, peacefully in her sleep back in Bismarck. Juliana grieved deeply, but also with gratitude for the reconciliation they had found in her aunt's final years. Cordelia left her entire estate to Juliana, including the house in Bismarck and a surprisingly substantial savings account. The money allowed Xavier and Juliana to expand their ranch significantly, buying neighboring land and building a proper house, comfortable and spacious. By the time Everett was 18 and Marielle was 16, the Pike Ranch had become a thriving operation, known throughout the territory for its quality cattle and honest dealings. Everett was showing interest in taking over the ranch eventually, while Marielle was demonstrating a talent for business and bookkeeping that would serve the family well. Xavier and Juliana, now in their 40s, would sit on their porch in the mornings with their coffee and watch the sun rise, just as they had done since the first days of their marriage. The porch faced east, exactly as Xavier had once promised, and the view was better than Juliana could have imagined all those years ago. You ever think about how this all started? Juliana asked one morning, her head resting on Xavier's shoulder. That desperate request in the boarding house hallway. I think about it all the time, Xavier said. Best decision I ever made saying yes to you. You never broke character, Juliana mused. Not once that whole first week. You were so convincing. That is because it stopped being a character almost immediately, Xavier said. By the second day, maybe the third, I was not pretending anymore. I was just being myself with you. I know, she said softly. I could tell. That was when I started falling in love with you, I think. When I realized you were not acting. We were both terrible at pretending, Xavier said with a smile. Lucky for us. Lucky for us, she agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky lighten and the ranch come to life around them. Everett emerged from the barn, ready to start the day's work. Marielle appeared on the porch of the main house, calling something to her brother. The cattle lowed in the distance. A hawk circled overhead, riding the early morning thermals. It was an ordinary morning on the Pike Ranch, one of thousands they had shared, and thousands more they would share if fortune allowed. But it was also extraordinary in its ordinariness, this life they had built from a lie that became truth, a pretense that became love, a single desperate request that had changed everything. I would do it all again, Juliana said suddenly. Every moment, every decision, every difficult conversation with my aunt. I would do it all exactly the same way if it meant ending up here with you. Xavier turned to look at her, his gray eyes still as steady and honest as they had been that first day in the boarding house hallway. So would I. You asked me to pretend for one dinner, and I ended up getting a lifetime. Best trade I ever made. She kissed him, tasting coffee and morning air and the comfortable familiarity of 20 years together. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. Come on, Xavier said, standing and offering his hand. Let us go see what kind of trouble our children are getting into. Juliana took his hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing, and let him pull her to her feet. They walked together toward the barn where Everett was working, and then to the house where Marielle was organizing the day's accounts. They worked together, ate together, laughed together. They were a family, solid and real, and built on a foundation of love that had started with a lie but had become the truest thing in both their lives. Years continued to pass in the way years do, measured in seasons and harvests, and the slow accumulation of days well lived. Everett married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, a capable woman named Sarah who fit seamlessly into the Pike family. Marielle married a lawyer from Albuquerque who respected her intelligence and supported her ambitions. Both of Xavier and Juliana's children stayed close, building their own lives while remaining deeply connected to the family ranch. Grandchildren arrived, loud and chaotic and beloved. Xavier taught them to ride and rope the way his father had taught him. Juliana sewed them clothes and told them stories about their grandparents' unconventional courtship, though she always softened the edges, making it sound more romantic than desperate. On their 25th anniversary, Everett and Marielle organized a party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from throughout the territory. It was a grand affair, with tables of food and music and dancing. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had departed and only family remained, Everett stood and called for everyone's attention. "I want to say something about my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the quieting crowd. Most people know that they had an unusual start to their relationship. What people might not know is that, from the very beginning, my father treated my mother with respect and devotion. He made her a promise that first evening, a promise to be the man she needed, and he has kept that promise every single day for 25 years. That is the kind of man he is. That is the kind of marriage they have built. And it is the model Marielle and I have tried to follow in our own lives. Xavier's eyes had gone bright. He reached for Juliana's hand under the table and squeezed tight. "To my parents," Everett concluded, raising his glass, "may they have 25 more years of happiness together." 25 more years, everyone echoed. Xavier stood, pulling Juliana up with him. "I only want to say one thing," he told the gathered family. "Everything good in my life came from one moment of saying yes when Juliana asked for help. If I had walked away, if I had said no, I would have missed everything that matters. So my advice to all of you is simple. When someone you care about asks for help, say yes. When love presents itself, even in strange circumstances, say yes. When you have a chance to build something real and lasting, say yes. That is how you end up with a life worth living." The party continued late into the night, full of music and laughter and the warmth of family. When it finally wound down and everyone had departed, Xavier and Juliana walked slowly back to their house, hand in hand, the way they had walked together 1,000 times before. 25 years, Juliana mused. It seems impossible. It seems like yesterday we were standing in that boarding house hallway and I was begging you to pretend to be my fiancé. "Best performance I ever gave," Xavier said with a smile. "The only performance you ever gave," Juliana corrected. "You are a terrible liar, Xavier Pike, always have been." "Good thing I never had to lie to you about the important things," he said. "I loved you from almost the beginning. That was always true." They reached their porch, the one that faced east, and sat down on the bench Xavier had built years ago. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. In the distance, they could hear the soft sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. "Do you remember what you said that first evening?" Juliana asked. "After we convinced Aunt Cordelia we were engaged and we were walking back to the boarding house. I said a lot of things that evening. You said that some of it was real for you," Juliana said. "That you were not entirely pretending. I think that was the moment I knew I was in trouble, the moment I knew I was falling for you and there was no going back." I was terrified when I said that, Xavier admitted. Thought you would panic and call the whole thing off. But I could not keep pretending something that felt so true. Had to be honest, even if it risked everything. I am glad you were honest, Juliana said. I am glad you never broke character, but I am more glad you stopped playing a character and just became yourself. That was what I fell in love with. Not the perfect, devoted fiancé, but the real man underneath. The one who was kind and patient and steady and true. Xavier pulled her close, and they sat together in the darkness, comfortable and content. After 25 years of marriage, there was little left to prove or explain. They knew each other completely, the good and the difficult, the strengths and the weaknesses. And they loved each other anyway, perhaps even more deeply because of that complete knowledge. If I could go back, Xavier said quietly, and tell that younger version of myself, the one standing in the boarding house hallway when you asked for help, what I know now, I would tell him to say yes faster. To not hesitate even for a second. To grab hold of the gift he is being offered and never let go. I would tell myself the same thing, Juliana said. I would tell myself that the quiet cowboy with the gray eyes is going to change my entire life. That asking him for help is the bravest thing I will ever do. That everything I am afraid of losing does not matter compared to what I am about to gain. They sat in silence for a long time, both of them lost in memory and gratitude. Finally, Xavier stood and offered his hand, pulling Juliana to her feet. "Come on, Mrs. Pike," he said. "Let us go to bed. We have a ranch to run in the morning." "We do," she agreed, and let him lead her inside. The years that followed were quieter, the pace of life slowing naturally as they aged. Xavier eventually handed over the day-to-day running of the ranch to Everett, though he still helped with the work when his body allowed. Juliana's sewing business transitioned to teaching younger women her techniques, passing on her knowledge and patterns. They spent more time with their grandchildren, spoiling them with stories and attention and unconditional love. When Xavier was 65 and Juliana was 58, they decided to make one last trip to Bismarck to visit Aunt Cordelia's grave and see the house where Juliana had grown up. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, a closing of a circle that had begun so many years before. They stood together in the cemetery, looking down at Cordelia's headstone, and Juliana felt a wave of affection for her difficult, stubborn, loving aunt. "Thank you," Juliana said quietly, speaking to the headstone. "Thank you for letting me make my own choices, even when you disagreed with them. Thank you for loving me enough to trust me, and thank you for eventually accepting Xavier. He made me happier than you could have imagined." Xavier put his arm around her shoulders. "She did her best by you in the end. That is all anyone can do." They visited the old house, which was now occupied by a young family who graciously allowed them to look around. Juliana showed Xavier the room where she had grown up, the kitchen where Cordelia had taught her to cook, the parlor where she had learned to sew. It was strange seeing it occupied by strangers, but also right. Houses were meant to be lived in, filled with new families and new stories. On their last evening in Bismarck, they had dinner at the hotel where they had first faced down Aunt Cordelia and Leonard Grisham all those years ago. The restaurant had been remodeled several times, but the basic structure was the same. They sat at a corner table, and Juliana found herself laughing at the memory of that tense first meal. "You were so calm," she remembered. "I was panicking internally, sure we were going to be exposed at any moment, and you just sat there answering Cordelia's questions like you had all the time in the world." "I was terrified," Xavier admitted, "but I had decided I was going to see it through, whatever it took. You had asked me for help, and I was not going to let you down." "You never let me down," Juliana said softly. "Not once in all these years. You have been exactly what you promised to be that first evening, a good man who would work hard to give me a decent life. You undersold yourself, though. It has been more than decent. It has been extraordinary. It has been ordinary, Xavier corrected gently. Wonderfully, beautifully ordinary. We worked and raised children and built a ranch and loved each other. That is not extraordinary. That is just life lived well. Maybe, Juliana allowed. But it is our ordinary life, and I would not trade it for anyone else's extraordinary one. They returned to New Mexico content, their trip having provided the closure they both needed. They settled back into the rhythms of ranch life, surrounded by family, living the life they had built together brick by brick, decision by decision, day by day. Xavier's health began to fail when he was 72, a slow decline that frustrated him but did not diminish his spirit. Juliana cared for him with the same devotion he had always shown her, and they faced his mortality together with the honesty that had always characterized their relationship. On a clear spring morning, when the sky was the bright blue of new beginnings, Xavier woke early and asked Juliana to help him out to the porch. They sat together watching the sunrise, as they had done for nearly 40 years, and Xavier took her hand. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice weaker than it used to be but still steady. "Every single day with you has been a gift. Every morning I woke up next to you, every evening we spent on this porch, every challenge we faced together. All of it has been exactly what I wanted. You gave me the best life I could have imagined." Tears streamed down Juliana's face. "You gave me the same thing. You saved me, Xavier, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "That is what partners do." He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep, with Juliana holding his hand. She grieved deeply, the loss cutting through her like a physical wound. But she also felt profound gratitude for the decades they had shared, for the life they had built, for the love that had sustained them both. Juliana lived another 8 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the matriarch of a sprawling family that carried on Xavier's values of hard work and kindness. She continued to live in the house they had built together, sitting on the porch every morning to watch the sunrise and remember. She told the story of their courtship often to anyone who would listen, always emphasizing the strangeness of how it began and the wonder of what it became. She wanted people to know that love could start in the most unlikely ways, that desperate measures sometimes led to beautiful outcomes, that saying yes to helping someone could change your entire life. On the morning of her 73rd birthday, surrounded by family who had gathered to celebrate, Juliana's oldest grandchild asked her what the secret was to a long and happy marriage. She thought about it for a long moment, remembering that boarding house hallway and Xavier's calm acceptance of her desperate request, remembering all the years that had followed, the struggles and triumphs and ordinary moments that had made up a lifetime. "The secret," she finally said, "is finding someone who shows up for you, someone who says yes when you ask for help, even when it is inconvenient or complicated. Someone who commits to the role and never breaks character until eventually it stops being a role at all and becomes just who they are. Your grandfather did that for me. I asked him to pretend for one dinner, and he pretended so well that it became real for both of us. That is the secret. Find someone who will show up and then show up for them in return. Everything else will follow." She died quietly a few weeks later, in the same bed where Xavier had died, in the house they had built together. Her children found her in the morning, a peaceful expression on her face, as though she had simply decided it was time to follow Xavier wherever he had gone. They buried her next to him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone that read, "Juliana Morgan Pike, 1861–1934, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. The family gathered for the funeral, 3 generations of Pikes, and afterward they stayed at the ranch house, telling stories and remembering. Everett stood on the porch that evening, looking out at the sunset, and thought about his parents. About the unlikely way they had come together, about the love that had sustained them through decades of challenges, about the legacy they had left behind in the form of family and land and values that would endure. They had something special, did they not? Marielle came to stand beside him, following his gaze. They did, Everett agreed. They built something real from something false, turned a desperate lie into the truest thing I have ever known. That takes a special kind of magic. Or just love, Marielle said. Real love, the kind that shows up every day and does the work. That was what they had. That was what made it magic. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Inside the house, their children and grandchildren were laughing and talking, carrying on the family traditions that Xavier and Juliana had started. The ranch would continue, passing down through generations, a living testament to what 2 people could build when they chose each other against all odds.